Alright fellas, it's time. Patch 1.6 is out. Let's have a look what Riot has in store for us here. So we have the Spirit Blossom patch coming up. This text section is basically by Ruben Zoo saying that this time they want to focus on nerfing certain archetypes over buffing others to ensure more diversity in the current meta. Right, here we have an announcement for the Spirit Blossom 1 month festival. Let's see. We have a new lab, much needed. The last one was pretty lame, if I may say so. Epic questions, rewards. Sure, that's going to be really good for new players. I like it. Might attract more people. Spirit Blossom event path. Alright, so they kind of copied something out of the playbook of Dota and the likes. And I guess Fortnite as well with battle passes. That's interesting. Let's see how good those cosmetics actually are. Alright, now the interesting part, card updates. Alright, Heimerdinger getting a much needed touch-up. They actually did end up switching the keywords around, which I am a fan of, I have to admit. Alright, the Elusive Turret's gonna be the 6 mana one, Fearsome at 3, Overwhelm at 4. I gotta say, I do like these changes overall. I think a card with such a polarizing mechanic as Heimer shouldn't be S tier or like the best card in the game. And I feel like this is gonna even out Heimer's power level a fair bit. Coming up, Braum. Okay, they're removing the 1 damage of the unleveled form. And technically also -1 on the leveled form. I think that's an alright change. Because they buffed Braum very majorly in 2 ways. Like 1, making him a removal unit the turn he's played. And 2, a value engine by generating the Poro. And the combination of both might have been too strong and make him like an almost auto-include in most sorts of Freljord decks. I think this is a pretty healthy change. Is Braum going to be too weak now? I don't think so. I think it's still going to be a solid champion in the respective archetypes. It's just not going to be splashed into random decks like the Kenku Elusive deck or Braum Swain. Maybe we'll see Swain Sejuani come back instead. Let's see, depending on how much they touch up aggro. Anivia's egg health gets reduced from 2 to 1. That's an interesting one. I think I like this change just because Anivia is so accessible right now with Rekindler's Mist Cause and Harrowings that it shouldn't be, or it shouldn't feel like almost impossible to remove her. That of course does put her into, or does put the egg into removal range of a lot of cheap cards like Vile Feast and Make It Rain. It should be a pretty impactful change overall, which is not a bad thing at all. Moving on, Relentless Pursuit gets put from fast to slow. I think this is a pretty smart change. I think a lot of, especially new players, get confused by the way you can use Relentless Pursuit as a fast spell to basically take away a responsive action by your opponent. I do really like this change. I think the rally mechanic was a bit overtuned and too strong coming into this. And it does like guarantee your opponent to have at least 1 reactive action at slow speed as well to answer your rally. I'm a fan of this change. We have Arena Bookie getting a buff. So both the cost gets reduced and the health gets raised. Well, what does this card even do? I forgot. Discard your lowest cost card to draw 1. So they did mention they want to buff discard archetypes. This is an interesting one. So it's basically like the philosophy behind this card is a value generator, right? Discarding your lowest cost and lowest effect card basically to potentially pick up something that can affect the game state more. I have no idea if this card's gonna find a home in any top tier deck or competitive play. It's very hard to say. Like, I've never really seen that effect be used. Let's see what's gonna happen. Right, next up we got Basilisk Rider's power being reduced by 1. Yeah, I think that does hit it in the right spot. It would be not so cool to just revert the old change, that would make Basilisk Rider really weak again. But right now, it's just the pure damage output and the tradability is just too strong. I do think this is probably the best way you could touch up the Basilisk Rider without killing the card, basically. Alright, the next change is long awaited. Crimson Disciples effect, only dealing 1 damage instead of 2 direct damage to the enemy nexus. Yeah, I think this was a much needed change. The whole Crimson Disciple Demolitionist Transfusion sort of package was played in way too many decks. In any kind of burn decks, even in more defensive decks like Braum Swain, they would often find their way, right? Just too versatile. And this should make the package be a bit more confined to certain archetypes and just not be overall so strong that it gets played in all sorts of decks. Kind of like with the Braum change that I mentioned earlier. And another tweak to a Noxus 2-drop. Legion Grenadier gets 1 extra health, but deals 1 less damage to the enemy nexus. Now, I think that is a very good change. Not only was the potential damage output of the card way too high, like basically in a burn deck, this is a Mystic Shot with a 3/1 body, right? Because you want to send burn towards opponent's face anyway. But also after Rearguard got reduced to 1 HP, like Noxus had way too many targets for Withering Wail and Static Shock and cards like that. So while making this card a bit less frustrating to play against due to the pure Nexus damage effect, it becomes a bit more sticky on board. I think that's a very smart change. It can trade a bit better. Might be what Noxus needs. Alright, Flash of Brilliance's cost gets changed from 3 to 4. Okay, so Heimerdinger kinda will have to give up its spot as a top tier deck most likely. I mean, Flash was realistically only ever used in Heimerdinger decks. It might still be playable in Heimerdinger decks, but now it gives the Overwhelm turret, which is still not awful, but it's not nearly as good as the Elusive turret, right? Heimerdinger players need way more protection setup. Like, they can't just go triple flash into Twin Disciplines on turn 5 anymore, obviously, due to always having to spend 1 extra mana per flash. I'm generally a fan of this whole change. Like I said earlier, I don't think a card like Heimerdinger should be amongst the best cards of the game. And I don't think it's going to be, like, Heimer is going to be unplayable, but it's just not going to be very strong anymore, which I'm a fan of. Alright, this is an interesting one. Some Dredger costs 1 more mana, but instead of only discarding a card, he now also draws a card. So 3 mana for 3 without creating a card disadvantage in hand, but being able to cycle certain stuff. That should be a strong card if discard archetypes will be strong in general. Let's see if they put any more changes onto them. Like, this won't be enough by itself to make discard aggro or stuff like that viable again, but it's definitely a step in the direction of making discard aggro a lot more consistent. You basically have a standard body 3 mana 4/3 for this cost with an upside effect, so if a deck builder can find efficient ways to actually utilize this upside effect, then this card might be good. Okay, Zornite Urkin gets changed in kind of a similar way. This is pretty big too. One of the Urkin's downsides was that it gives you a temporary card disadvantage. Now, instead of having the draw on last breath, like when the unit dies, it draws a card immediately while being played. It's a thematically consistent change. I do like it. I gotta admit, I'm kind of curious to try out discard archetypes, but as long as there's just not more positive, like more upsides of discarding stuff, I still don't see discard being top tier decks. Alright, this change is pretty big. Shadow Assassin gets her power tweaked down from 2 to 1. Shadow Assassin has been probably the most played card, or one of the most played cards for a long time. This, like, Shadow Assassin is a very hard thing to balance, right? If you tweak any of the numbers up or down by 1, like power, health, or mana cost, it's gonna be very impactful, and I'm not sure if this card's still gonna see a lot of play. I mean, sure, it can still trade with like Greenglade Duos and Navori Blade Scouts, but not anymore with like Conspirators and the likes, a lot of other board stuff. It doesn't put stuff into static shock range that effectively anymore, and most important of all, it doesn't just generate as much consistent chip damage as it did. So this is a pretty impactful nerf to all sorts of Ionia archetypes, I feel like. Steel Tempest cost going from 3 down to 2. I still think this would only make sense in Yasuo decks. I'm not sure if you would even want to main deck it. I guess it's okay, but it still doesn't feel quite as good as a card like Concussive Palm, which can also be used offensively, and basically for the 2 mana extra cost, it generates a 3/2 unit. It's just more value in a card. So Steel Tempest maybe we'll see some plays as a 1-off or 2-off in Yasuo decks, but I wouldn't even be too sure about that. River Shaper getting a buff to his health. Yeah, that does make sense. I don't think that's going to make the card too strong. Like, the only archetype I can think of is good old Fiora River Shaper combo decks, right? Most other archetypes don't really play River Shaper due to a lack of protection. Should help the card overall. I don't think it's going to be overpowered. Probably a good little buff here. Alright, and this is going to be a huge one. Willow Ionia gets its cost increase from 4 to 5. Now, Willow Ionia is, I think a lot of people would agree that it's the best card in the game. There's nothing that comes close to like cost-efficient removal and making your opponent lose tempo like Willow Ionia does. Like, this card on its own shapes and defines the meta in so many ways. This card makes archetypes like Deep or good old Boar Mother's Control so much harder to play, especially in ladder where you cannot ban out Ionia. This is a very big change. Also, it's going to be less of an auto-include in decks like Elusives or in like aggressive or mid-rangey decks. Overall, Ionia getting touched up quite a bit, which I do like to see. It's going to have less oppressive power on the meta. Like, it's not going to shape the meta quite as hard as it used to the whole time. Okay, next change. Looks a bit random at first sight. Narwhal instead of a 3 mana 2/4 is now a 2 mana 2/3. Still not going to be main decked, but it does make sense in combination with this next card tweak. Hunting Fleet, 4 mana 6/6 instead of 5 mana 7/7. I still think Hunting Fleet will only see play as an expedition card. I can't really imagine decks that would want to main deck it. The cost efficiency is not, like the cost stat efficiency is not big enough for this to be in top tier decks, I feel like. And what else do we have here? Personalization, sure. Epic tier board. Oh, that actually looks kind of cute. Deck bundles. Okay, more stuff for new players. It's always kind of nice to have. Might increase the player base. Expeditions archetypes. Sure, I won't go through them right here. Let's see if there's any interesting bug fixes. Alright, the only important one I see is this one, the infamous Azrael bug, where he sometimes still levels after the target gets glimpsed or something like that. Apart from that, some minor bug fixes. Sure, everything's going the right way. And that's it for this patch. Okay, let's think about meta predictions here. So we have Heimerdinger's power level be reduced drastically. We have Ionia being touched up and Noxus being touched up. And also Braum and Anivia. What does that make space for? I feel like we'll see a much larger variety of mid-range decks now that kind of auto-lose to Weimer. And also, we might see some more top-end control-heavy decks due to Willow Ionia being less efficient, and decks like Karma Azrael also being affected by the Shadow Assassin nerf and maybe being played a bit less. I could see decks like War Mother's Control coming back. Maybe Deep will see a bit more play especially if everyone starts playing more mid-rangey stuff first, and then deep might be a good answer to that, like to slower mid-rangey decks. Also with Braum and Anivia being gone, one of the more oppressive control decks against both mid-range and very fast aggro. Yeah, I think we'll see a larger variety of mid-range decks, to be honest. Now, an interesting question would be whether Ezreal Karma loses its top spot to Ezreal Freljord. It's also affected by the Braum nerf, I feel like, but Ezreal Freljord should still have a lot of tools and be really good against mid-rangey stuff. I feel like Ezreal is still going to be one of the best cards, if not the best card in the game. Ezreal kind of having dodged this patch should see a lot of play still. And I could see more combo-oriented control decks like Karina control, maybe Swain decks, and like I mentioned, deep decks see more play, which were being oppressed by decks like Darrowing or Triple Rally Demacia before. So yeah, that's going to be interesting. I can't wait to see how the meta shapes, how all of those nerfs are going to affect the game. Some of them are going to be pretty big, namely Heimerdinger, Braum, and the Willow Ionia change, as well as just key Noxus units being tweaked down a bit. So let's see if this actually gives us the variety in meta that we were hoping for, or if maybe Ezreal decks just take over completely and stomp everything. It's too early to say yet. I'll be optimistic. And yeah, I hope to see you guys on the stream one of these days. Have a good day and see you around.